We are joined by Tekano Senior Fellows or Global Fellows for Atlantic Institute. We are joined by Tami Wukwe, Mabelandile Twani, Bayanda Ndumiso, and Sibongile Mdungwa, and Ndobuhlanga Mkushulu. And what we have given this comrade as a mandate for this afternoon is we've been engaged today. We're building on our previous session with Comrade Lauren Paramu, and we're saying this is the context, which we've done so much work since this morning in laying out and framing the current political context and what it means for our livelihoods. And we thought we then put together these comrades to say, unfortunately, society remains segregated. How political shifts and policies implicate have implications on our livelihoods remains a gendered question, remains a racial question, remains a class question, and remains a question of geographic discrimination, depending where you find yourself in the world. So we then said, let's have a conversation to say we have this global context and these global crises that are intersecting. How are they implicating on what we call intersecting marginalities? Typically, people speak of marginalized groups in society, and sometimes we talk of vulnerable groups, women, children, the LGBTQIA community, people in rural areas, people in the global south. So how all of these shifts in global politics have implications on our livelihood is very much dependent on where we are located in society, located in terms of identity, located in terms of space, of literal physical geography, located in questions of gender. So we're going to start with you, Sanga. I'm going to come to you, comrade. I want you to kick us off with the gender question, particularly around politics of being women, the feminist perspective in how we understand the world.
I think my point of departure is really what you are focusing on. Why are we here today? We are here today because, of unjust systems, that we live under. And as women in particular, patriarchy, and I think this module is really looking at that. So that's why we are here today. But also just in terms of what we are talking about today, which is intersectionality, we also recognize, that there's no such thing as a single issue struggle. Our struggles intersect. So which is really exciting, for me to be part of this engagement. So for me, I tend to think about, women's struggle through a feminist lens, because I find that lens for me is much more robust politically, It's not a lens that just focuses on issues of representation, we also have a place here. It's not just about that. It's a lens that analyzes, the context and how did we get here? What are the root causes? It's a lens that actually seeks to disrupt, as an unjust system. It's a lens that seeks to dismantle an unjust system. So for me, that's why I would align, with myself with that. And also just to say that maybe an hour or so before the session started, I saw a tweet from the Star that said Black women don't want condoms, or don't want to use condoms or something like that, in reference to a released study around HIV/AIDS infections and how HIV infections are much more prevalent amongst the youth cohort, in particular young Black women, which is not something new, something that we know. But for me, it was the framing of the whole thing, which just confirms why we need to, to stand boldly and challenge these narratives that seek to shift the blame, from our understanding doing the work. We know why that is the status quo. We know it's unequal power dynamics because young women in relationships with older men are not able to negotiate condom use. So to have a headline that just takes over and says that has been quite disturbing as I was preparing to start this session. So I just wanted to also bring that to the table to say this is why we use this particular lens that is really robust and in terms of engagement and challenging dominant narratives about women and why situations are the way that they are. But also coming to the question that you asked us to address, Thandokazi, around the struggles, what are the struggles? And also around the neoliberal policies, structural adjustments, austerity, all those things. So when I was thinking about that, obviously for me, the impact is the commodification of healthcare. It's a commodity that is inaccessible, that becomes inaccessible to a majority, whether you're a woman, you are poor, you are Black, you are in a rural areas, So it makes those who are vulnerable in society, much more vulnerable, because of limited access to healthcare. But also it promotes a much more, which is the sinister motive, obviously, a much more sinister motive around a growing reliance on private healthcare. So it's how we accept all of these things as being normal, and we don't interrogate the sinister motives behind all of those things. So I thought of an example, not even a South African example. I saw something the other day on the week, the vice president of the US, as part of campaigning maybe for the next term or something, Kamala Harris, talking about how they've kept, the prices of insulin. So at a point where a first world country uses that, to campaign, how did they get there in the first place? And how do we avoid getting there? Because it's easy for us to consume everything and to follow policy imperatives, that come from the global north. So how did they get there? For them to actually campaign to say, we have now kept the price of insulin. And if you could think of the time when the price of insulin was extremely high, who suffered the most? Who is poor in the US? It's Black people, it's Black women, and all of those things. So I think for me, those are some of the issues that have been grappling with. And another issue that I wanted to bring to the fore was this issue of unpaid care work. That it's not just an issue that we really focus on and talk about quite a lot. But if we thought about if women had time, to do other things, what would they do? And one of the other things that research has told us, some of the Oxfam reports have said, is that if women had time, spent less time on unpaid care work, they would have the time to seek healthcare services. One of the reasons they don't seek healthcare services is because simply they don't have time. They are being cared for, they're caring for everyone, and that is unpaid for care work. And it's and for me, the other thing that I also want to mix into this thing is issues of public infrastructure. So for me, nothing is neutral. Even policies, even public infrastructure policies are not neutral. They are gendered in a way. The fact that there's poor service delivery, there's no water, there's no access to water, how does that impact women in particular, poor women in particular, who have to spend a lot of time going out looking for water? So if those services, were easily accessible, that the provision of these services, it could actually reduce, the demands to the women at a household level. So those are some of the things that we have to think about, that when we talk about women's health, we have to think holistically and broadly, and understand that some of these policies are not neutral. They are actually quite gendered. And how do we challenge those policies? And I think for me, one of the things that I really want to maybe speak on is poor policy in implementation, but also reversal of policy gains. So, we spend a lot of time as activists working towards getting a particular policy passed. But I think if we can keep in mind the fact that some of the policies, can actually be reversed, and understand that, and keep a sharp eye on the political environment, and involve ourselves in terms of the political environment, we would be able to avoid some of the challenges. If you look at the termination of pregnancy, a pregnancy act in South Africa, and the poor implementation around that, and the impact that it is having on women, you will understand how necessary it is for us to stay the course and stay vigilant when it comes to policy implementation. And I also want to use the US again as an example. The reversal of Roe versus Wade last year, a reversal of a 50 years old policy, around women's access to abortion services in the US. Who would have thought the day would come? So we must be aware of what's happening around us, how certain, forces are moving and consolidating and gaining ground, whilst maybe, Tina, we are very insular, we are in our echo chambers and all of those things, because we want to talk to people that say exactly what we want to hear and all of those things. So I think that's another thing that I really wanted to bring to the fore. But I think in closing, Tandokas, one of the things that I really wanted to answer, the questions that I wanted to answer that you asked us, the issues that we must grapple with as activists. Who funds the fight? Who, in our struggle, where does the money come from? Because one of the reasons some of these gains get reversed is issues of funding. And also because one thing that I've realized recently is that at some point our struggles intersect, but at another point our struggles do not intersect. What's happening in Gaza is a clear demonstration of that. The silence is loud from so many spaces. And I'm not even excluding myself. It's loud from so many spaces because of where the money comes from. That's number one. And because our struggles might intersect around child marriages, but when it comes to Gaza, our struggles, so I don't have answers for those things, but I think it's things that I just wanted to put, to put on the table. And for me, it's really about money. It's about where the money comes from. Are there other alternatives in terms of the struggle and funding what needs to be done beyond what we rely on right now? Because what we rely on right now actually demands us to mute ourselves at a certain point. That's the first thing. And then the other thing that I wanted to talk about is return to my issue around echo chambers and how other forces are gaining ground. A big part of our work in the feminist space is around the comprehensive sexuality education. And I do believe we are losing the fight against the conservative forces that are pushed by the conservative agenda that is pushed by the churches and all of those people, how they have managed to grab the mindset of society, how they have managed in terms of parents, teachers, to be the people who get listened to, that our message around issues of maybe comprehensive sexuality education get diluted with messages around morality or immorality, and how we are not taking space around that, yeah. How much time do I have? Oh, I thought someone was telling me I don't have time. That is the second thing.
I do have a timer. You have about 1 minute, 49 seconds.
Okay. Okay, so that's one thing that I think we must grapple with, you know, in terms of the propaganda that is out there and how do we counter it. The other thing that I think we must grapple with is the deliberate co-opting and the fracturing of civil society movements. You know, if you are a very disruptive type of movement, you get the attention that you need, and we must be disruptive. But at a certain point, it's either you are co-opted or there is an attempt to fracture that movement. And it can even be violence, it can be anything. You know, one of the things that I know, you know, when we were part of the total shutdown, you know, and being active, the agenda is very much, you know, I feel like a bit muted down to what was the initial, because, you know, government came on board. So you must weigh when government comes on board, you know, what are the benefits, what are the risks? So as you do the work, just weigh. But we know there's very powerful movements out there, but they are paying the price with their lives. Whether it's abahlali basemjondolo or abantu basekolobeni, they are paying with their lives. But they are very, very powerful movement. So you must make that choice. You must make that deep reflection for yourself as you move forward. I think the other things that I wanted to talk about lastly is the 16 days of activism. And just to close maybe with to read something from Pumla Gola's book, Female Fear Factory, just on feminism, you know. It's going to be a quick read, because we tend to think that certain countries, you know, there's more patriarchy there, there's less patriarchy here, because of maybe of what we see. Because she's making the statement based on the activism by the women of Saudi Arabia to be able to get driver's license. For us, it's a very ridiculous thing, and therefore would assume, you know, that the patriarchy there, you know, there's patriarchy there, maybe there's less patriarchy this side. But in her book, the Female Fear Factory, she says, feminism is the constant refusal to be held down. It is the fight against being kept in a feminine place by the female fear factory in Saudi Arabia or anywhere else in the world. Having spoken about the situation in Saudi Arabia, she gives an example about female fear factory in South Africa. She says, one of my students invoked the female fear factory in a class discussion when she declared, by the time I arrive for this class at 9 a.m., I have already fought 100 wars. This was a Black woman born past apartheid, a student at the prestigious University of Witwatersrand. Walking from her parents' home to take a minibus taxi, several men had commented on her body and tried to get her attention in a manner that suggests sexual interest, but really communicates entitlement to her body and her exclusion from ownership of public space. This is something that I'm very passionate about, because it's 16 days of activism. And we're talking about women's health, we talk about women's safety, and rightly so, because of the numbers, we focus on intimate partner violence and all of those things. But let's also look broadly at society and the spaces and the messages, especially the messages that are subtle or not so subtle, that are telling women, this is your place. This is where you're supposed to be. This is what you are supposed to do, not to be affected by violence in this way, because that it silences us in other ways, in so many ways. So if you find that you are in an environment that seeks to invalidate or silence women, find the courage within you to actually challenge the status quo. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sis Kanda, for that very insightful, very thought-provoking input. So to you, Cohort 5, these are our fellows. very strong feminist perspective there, Hlanga. Thank you so much, and thank you for bringing it, for giving it life, not just being an abstract. Women have always been at the center of our struggles through history. Butami, I'm gonna come to you, comrade, because unfortunately race remains a factor, a determining factor, especially around issues of housing, of health equity, of struggle. When we find ourselves in society is very much determined by preconceived ideas of who we are based on our race and based on so many other factors. Take us through, comrade, what does this all mean when we use the critical race framing and understanding these struggles we're grappling with in society?
Thanks very much, Thando. Ngiyabonga nakuSis Thando. She has just made inputs that are very important, especially when it comes to the issue of who funds the funders or who funds the fund. I think it's directly related to the topic that I am given. I'm saying that because I do think that the question of race, it's a question of power, and the question of funding, it's also the question of power. So there's a saying that says, who pays the piper calls the tune. So in this instance, who calls the piper are the white people, because they're the ones that are with the money, and we black people, we work for them. I just wanted to open my talk with that. It's not going to be easier for me to unpack the question of racism without looking at the question of colonialism and the response, an organized response by the colonized to that question. So colonialism and the response of people, which is Black consciousness, which is actually a response to racism, are going to be featured a lot as I try to unpack this question of racism. Ngiyanibulisa kwakhona nonke, greetings to you all. In all shades and hues, colonialism begins with words and in the minds. This means that colonialism involves a discursive process of controlling a people's definition and understanding of themselves and the world around them, using social stratification, skewed and racial allocation of power and resources, and linguistic and cultural hegemony to dictate a particular worldview and conceptualization of social reality to people, and therefore imposing a false consciousness and a false identity on people. By false identity, we refer to an identity which is not informed by a people's historical, material realities and socio-economic political conditions, but is carved for them by officialdom, the corporate media, and mass culture. For example, the people of Rwanda speak one language, Kinyarwanda. A language is a courier of people's historical, cultural heritage. This means that they share one historical, cultural heritage and have knowledge and belief system and one norm and value system. But when the Belgians colonized that country, they came up with a social classification system whereby everyone and anyone who had 10 cows was classified as a Tutsi, and everybody having less than 10 but up to 5 cows was called a Hutu. All who had lesser cows were Mutwa. In the identity document, these class divisions were recorded as races. So what began as a social stratification system imposed by colonialists was systematically codified to yield tribal divisions. Whereas no tribes but one people existed before. These were the roots of the genocide of 1994, where 1 million people were killed in 100 days. In Azania, South Africa, occupied South Africa, the apartheid regime arbitrarily imposed the terms Kafir, Bantu, Native, Bushman, Colored, Kuli on Black people and African people, the indigenous African people. Black people of Khoisan and the Malay origin, and Black people of Asian or Indian Pakistan origin. They went further to associate these labels with derogatory, dehumanizing, degrading, and denigrating stereotypes about Black people. Through this, they systematically instilled in Black people an inferiority complex that made them to be ashamed of their Blackness and venerate whiteness and aspire to be white. Because as Frantz Fanon articulated in Black Skins and White Mask, my body was given back to me, sprawled out, distorted, recolored, clad mourning. The Negro is an animal. The Negro is ugly. Look at the nigger. It is cold. The nigger is cold. The little black boy is trembling because he is afraid of the nigger. Furthermore, they created socio-economic political inequities, boundaries, and barriers that serve to entrench these stereotypes and myths. The socio-economic conditions of poverty and squalor in varying degrees serve not only to brutalize Black people into self-shame and self-hate, but also to also set the different sections of Black community against each other. It was divide and rule strategy to act as a bulwark against Black people of diverse origin, from uniting around common problems and issues and shared aspirations and needs. It is in this context that the Black consciousness movement initiated what Biko referred to as an inward-looking process of self-definition. This meant that we had to define ourselves on the basis of shared socio-economic and political conditions and historical material experiences. We found that irrespective of whether we are of Indian, Pakistan, Malay, Khoisan origin, or so-called non-racial parentage, we are economically excluded from owning the major means of production and productive land, politically excluded from universal adult suffrage, and socially degraded. Therefore, we agreed on Black as a political term, referring to everybody who is psychologically oppressed, economically exploited, politically discriminated against, and socially denigrated by apartheid capitalism. Paradoxically speaking, Black included all people anywhere in the world who share the conditions of being by law or tradition, psychologically exploited, economically oppressed, politically discriminated, and socially degraded, be it in Palestine, US, Brazil, or Australia. It was imperative that an oppressed people in search of liberation should define and name themselves, because naming is an expression of power and authority, and a political act, an act of authority and power. When a person defines and names a thing, he or she actually exercises power and authority over that thing. The definer and the namer define the reality of the named and shape the very being and destiny of the named. To be defined and named by the other, or take the identity and consciousness carved by one for you, is to be robbed a sense of identity. To be denied a sense of self-identity is to be denied a sense of being and belonging. No one can be free as long as he or she is made in the image of someone else. So, the process of self-definition and self-naming is the stepping stone towards consciousness. Consciousness is the activator of action, and action is the shaper and reshaper of one's reality, experience, and destiny. As Biko taught us, you cannot be conscious and remain inactive. consciousness should steer you to an action, and action should be aimed at a movement and a change. This is what we mean by the Black consciousness movement, is moving from experience to consciousness, to action, to the changing of experience. One's conditions, experiences, realities, situation, environment, and context inform the process of self-definition and self-awareness, self-reliance, and self-assertiveness. Self-consciousness, self-reliance, and self-assertiveness lead to independent, creative, ingenious, and innovative action, and action brings about change. But here we are talking of a collective self-consciousness of people, social action and a social change. Why is the exercise of self-identity and self-definition so important for people fighting slavery, colonialism, and imperialism? Slavery and colonialism in their varying forms were not geared only at exploiting Black people economically, but were also aimed at reshaping their reality so that they become willing slaves and willing servants. For instance, in Azania, the system was geared at making the demands of apartheid the cornerstone of Black people's reality, so that fulfillment for them should mean filling the role into which the philosophy of colonialism has molded them. In other words, Black people had to affirm the white man's stereotypes about them and not question the white man's assertion and their supposed sacrosanct authority. Therefore, the Black person was not portrayed as a human being, but depicted as a type. As a type, the Black person could either be good, nigger, fulfilling the role assigned to him or her by authority.
Comrade, sorry to cut you. 1 more minute. The 10 minutes is lapsed. Okay.
All right. Well, the Black consciousness argues that only those who possess power and resources can control the process of generation, accumulation, and dissemination of knowledge and information, and therefore dictate how history is written and how society is organized economically, socially, politically, and culturally. As I said before, the question of racism is a question of power. You cannot be a racist without a power. One has to have a power for him or her to be a racist. So when whites came here, they took over the economic, the resources, and then they were not satisfied with that. They went further to cultural, spiritual, and other aspects of our life, including naming us. So hence I'm saying the question of racism is the question of power. So when we talk about poverty in South Africa, not only in South Africa, all over the world, it's given that we are talking about referring to Black people because those are the people that are powerless. But that is not naturally created, but it is a deliberate act by those whose motive is exploitation and oppression. So racism comes from, all these systems of oppression, exploitation, slavery, colonialism, apartheid, until to where we are, neo-colonial system. So for us to be able to, including, the structural adjustment programs that are having the kinds of demands that they have to our country, where the social needs of our people have to be
I think we lost Botani there. But he will join us for the plenary reflections. We'll get to engage with him again. And thank you. That was Bhutan, one of our fellows rooted in the land struggle in the south of Johannesburg. And often, Bayand, I'm coming to you. Often when we center race, we seem to all agree we're all Black, and we exclude the conversation about being queer within this conversation, and we do this is exactly why we're intentional in bringing together this panel, so that we can create the very glaring, actually, linkages in our struggles. So Bayana is going to talk to us about what do these health inequities, what do these crises mean for when you are queer?
One of the most powerful political organizations in this country, a true example of what this question you're asking, Thandokazi, and hopefully there is a comrade from EFF in this discussion, who talk about race, who talk about land, and everyone that is spoken and reflected here totally forgot that queerness is in the middle of all of that circus. And they've proven to us by inviting the most homophobic professor in land who support the Ugandan criminalization laws, who has been public, but when it comes to queerness, then comrades are always like, wait. We're allowed to question. We're allowed to explore what other possible ways that we can talk about this. So I'm giving you an example of what it means for us to always be secondary out of these important struggles like your race, your class, and so on, and I can count. And that's for me, that was a turning point for us to realize that people pick and choose what matters at different times and in different, zones according to what they find as agency. Now, comrades that I spoke here, they did use the word intersectional, and how all of these intersectional struggles often intersect, but often don't really show each other at one instant, right? But I'm using this example to say that was for me an alarming point where, a week before we saw Julius Malema, if you're reading the news, wearing a queer rainbow flag across him and leading one of the biggest protests in Pretoria and saying, I support queer politics and I'm here for the queers and I'm against the Ugandan bill. A month later, again, we're seeing the same person who says that we are allowed to have our own opinions. But that's the thing for me, is the fact that you're allowed to talk about how much I'm dying. You're allowed to talk about my sexuality as if femicide of queer people is not real. You want to negotiate my life. On what terms are you saying that now we can have an opinion on who to leave and not to leave? And I wanted to start this conversation, but rather this opening, by saying that the reality of queer people is linked to race, to class, to women issues, to children issues in this country. And it continues to be prevalent in different political platforms and different turning points. Now, what are our issues? We all know that when HIV and AIDS became a reality in this country, the first accused was that it's those men that sleep together. When everything comes in this country, and especially when it's about health, monkeypox, there were different articles in this country that were saying that maybe it's coming also with that LGBTI DSTV, community. And that's the thing about this, is that we are always an scapegoat, but an scapegoat that always catches the fire in terms of being totally ignored and totally being, the system, the justice system, the health system is continuous in the way they exclude us, whether it's through social cohesion and culture, whether it's through its own policies. Priority for LGBTIQ plus communities is just prevalent on how we're continuously being ignored. Again, so what are our issues? It's prevalent in the LGBTIQ plus community that we are one of the vulnerable groups in terms of HIV and AIDS, STIs, and TB. And Uhlanga, Uchoka Mandi comrade, when Uhlanga said that if there was no discrimination, if there was a health system where LGBTIQ plus people were welcomed as they are, they would access healthcare systems. Because we know the kind of discrimination, that already is a step, for us, is a closure to say that don't seek for help, don't expose yourself to violence, and therefore stay in your corner. So let's not be surprised when we are saying, why are they having them, why are they have HIV and AIDS? Why are they, they have STIs? It's because there's no space for us to go and seek for help. And the space that we need to go to, it's often that even in the system, LGBTIQ plus individuals are not catered for. So, I mean, such things as like, being killed. I mean, in Kailicha, if you look online again, in Kailicha, you have free gender who continuously march outside Kailicha court for court cases where lesbians, specifically women, are being killed by their own friends. And cases are unsolvable. Dockets are missing. I can count even more when you feel like, why is there no agency to basically bring forth justice for the LGBTIQ plus community? So these also are very prevalent in the fact that if you look at Cape Town and you look under the bridge, most, and I can say proudly because there's a report that was done by Triangle Project that I can share with everyone that talks about being unhoused and living in Cape Town, on how most people that live under the bridge are often queer and sex workers. And that struggle interacts because if you are a sex worker in this country and you are queer and you must live in a shelter, the shelter wants you to be inside the shelter at 4 p.m., for an example. And then if you're a sex worker, that's the time when it's your peak hour to go and work. So often queer people that are sex workers urge to go and sleep on the streets because of that. They are sex workers and they need to work. So most people that are living on the street are LGBTIQ plus people, and they are unhoused because of family rejection and so many reasons that you can think of, right? But who is the role player in that, right? And I can say it bluntly. City of Cape Town plays a huge role into making sure that the policies that Lushanga was talking about are implemented in Cape Town. Most unhoused people in Cape Town who are queer and sex workers are being harassed every day by law enforcement and often died on the streets, and others die in prison, right? And that is policies that are formed, which is called the bylaws, that criminalize these LGBTIQ plus people and sex workers in Cape Town specifically. So now, discrimination is not just, one way or two ways. Discrimination is broad. There's institutional racism, where you can access, for example, an education institute that do not recognize LGBTIQ plus students, does not recognize the fact that your background, your class, your race, and all of these things that put you in a category to be minority is not being realized. So there's an assumption that we all start in the same line. And if you look at privilege and you've done privilege work, it is a proven activity that we're all not the same. But we can all walk into a classroom and sit on this Zoom call, but our struggles are different. And most queer people are often at the back because all of these struggles, from the on-go, when they access primary care system, they transmit primary education, when they access community culture and all of these things, the first thing is for them to be rejected, to experience rejection, because they look different, because they don't belong, because there's something that is not either or. They just something that is not acceptable. So our struggles are always everywhere. You walk out, you come in, you just experience violence because you look different and you present different. So where am I getting to? So all of these things, obviously, they create social anxiety for us. They create deep psychosocial issues when it comes to mental health, to belonging, to, accessing information and resources as well. So the fact that also all of that, it sits with us as LGBTIQ plus individuals to educate and implement is a lot of work, right? Because, when Mase does not know what the other letters stand for, we assume that Bahanda must be willing to basically educate immediately. So the burden of having to educate and the burden of having to be the token and perform your queerness in order for you to exist is quite exhausting to do the work that we are doing. Because often when we protest and when we demand for things, and often when we, we demand policies, the government often asks, what do you mean? I don't know your community. Educate us about your community. But you're just like you are a country that literally formed laws to protect the LGBTIQ plus community, but you keep on gaslighting us and our experiences to say, we don't know what you're talking about. Maybe you need to, you need to educate us more. So Thando, I know I'm left with 3 minutes to be specific. I have my
30 seconds. 30 seconds. 30 seconds.
So for me, it's like, for me, experiencing racism, experiencing xenophobia, homophobia, transphobia, and intersexphobia attitudes in South Africa, they are prevalent everywhere, right? And it's funny, the fact that the Constitution is not translated into enforcing, or rather forcing institutes to see queer students, or rather to realize queer students or queer, employees and. A lot of people continue to be violated on the basis that I don't know how to treat you, teach me how to treat you. And therefore, a lot of people assume that it's okay for us to continuously educate. So I want to bring all of these struggles together because I've said a lot of things. For us as queer people, being unhoused is a big thing because of this discrimination. Belonging is a huge thing because we don't belong anywhere. We don't belong in the education, in the health, everywhere that you can count, in the culture. We don't belong anywhere. We have to continuously navigate our existence and mostly negotiate our existence and our lives in every space that we navigate. True, health system is one of the biggest departments that have pushed the LGBTIQ plus to the edge in accessing healthcare system. The other one is the fact that there is a deep need for comprehensive education and sensitization education that needs to happen. But can this happen without actually communities allowing themselves to learn, unlearn, and make sure that they relearn together with us? The biggest question is the fact that you can give people information, but if they choose to cloud, their judgment with culture, sexuality, and religion, it's very much often that you would find these issues continuous. As Uhlanga has said, the fact that most people that do not want to perform abortion, it's because they're using these principles to say that, no, I don't believe in this, I'm a Christian. And it's the same thing when it comes to us and accessing healthcare system. Race sometimes, culture and traditions are used to prevent us from continuing. So this work is, for me, talks about two things, Thando. Where do we see the power and where do we see our positionality as a queer community? And how do we center ourselves in the middle of this crisis? And how do we access, how do we test these forces that outplay all of these experiences? Because the anti-gender movement is here and it's big and it's growing. You see a lot of people who now are not afraid of standing in front of social media, create videos and hate and instill violence and instigate violence, and they still get away with it. You see a lot of people who still use the term, it's my opinion, while they are literally putting everyone's life at risk for having that opinion that instigate violence. So we're in deep shit, we're in trouble, but we are here, comrades.
Amanda, we are here and we're not gonna stop. Thank you, Mayanda, for those inputs. We'll get to engage comrades just after bells. Comrade Mabelandile, bells, Bele, Twani. We are Black, we are queer, but society remains stratified. There's the other side of Joburg, and then there's the other one over the bridge. There's the other side of Khayelitsha, and then there's also the other side of Khayelitsha. There's the other side of Gqeberha, and there's the other side. Comrade Bells is gonna offer us a class analysis in understanding how these oppressive systems operate and who gets to benefit and who gets to suffer. Over to you, Comrade Bells.
I will start differently, comrades, and say, for example, 1994, for example, is many people are talking about 1994. And to us as Black people, 1994 was an illusion, for example, on the promise which the ruling party has made, in particular the ANC, when it comes to the question of land. For example, we had these illusions back in the days that it might happen that we might stay in Constantia one day after 1994, or we will move to relocate to the previous lands that we couldn't go to due to apartheid legislatives. But again, 1994 was proven to be a sellout project up to a point that those who were leading during 1994 in the ANC, who are still leading, for example, the ANC, they had no interest for Black working class in particular. For example, they've agreed in many wrong economic policies which are based on capitalism, which are perpetuating neoliberalism in particular. For example, where they say the private property must be kept intact. So therefore, if you remain in Bondeville, you must stay in Bondeville. All the developments must happen in Bondeville. Even when the state wants to build houses, the houses must not be built towards the city, or for example, in our context, the city of Cape Town. You can't be in Constantia, you can't be in Seapoint. You must remain where you are. Even you can see from the attitude of Human Settlement Department, even when they build RTP houses, they don't target these places because they know for sure it's private property protection, you know. So we are in that mess because of such adoption. But again, that adoption is coming from the legacy of apartheid, even before the time of negotiations. There were agreements that we are going to keep things intact, those who are running the economy and those who are captains of the economy must remain in power. I'm taking, in our context, it would be white monopoly capital, those who are holding power in South Africa. So as a result of that, many people, many Black working class areas were kind of overcrowded and are still overcrowded, and it's difficult even now to manage Black working class families. For example, if you are a household, you can't manage your family. If people wants to come and stay with you, you cannot say, I don't want you, you know, and such things. So up to a point that now the departments and the human settlement in South Africa couldn't handle even the economic policies that they've passed, which are neoliberal, were kind of focusing on cutting on social spending. There will be no more money going for social spending, such as basic services, such as housing, such as health. And that for me resulted to a point where people can notice that there is a big challenge for us when it comes to housing. To a point that they couldn't handle themselves. Even now, people are not handling themselves. They've come across open spaces which are more around them and occupy them and make them their living space or their homes, for example. But again, within that context, they are still facing state brutality from the side of the state, because the state is acting to protect the private property, as I said earlier on. So we are still stuck with that kind of an arrangement of 1994, which we call it housing crisis and land question in South Africa. Further, Makabane, is that there are other means in which the working class is responding to these questions that we are raising when it comes to housing, when it comes to health, for example, because we know and we understood that if there is a crisis in housing, it will mean there will be a crisis in health, and the crisis in health will be more worse than what we are experiencing now. So there are voices, sorry, comrade, there are voices below. For example, we have been drawing lessons from other movements inside South Africa and outside South Africa. For example, the MST movement, which promises possibilities, the health equity that we are looking for example, they are practicing it where they draw all, for example, all those who claim to represent the working class, whether it's a middle class or anyone that has a sympathy to the working class, and draw their own institution within the occupations where, for example, those who are participating in the movement, they can also be converted to understand theories, for example, the theory of liberation, from Paul Frere and so on. So I'm trying to put possibilities that, for example, whatever struggle that we are doing, there are alternatives, for example, that people have been proposing, and others are in practical things that are taking place, for example. And they are proofs that people have been kind of having power within themselves. For example, they have been building their own ways of learning within these land occupations and the space in which the state has closed down. For example, I made an example of the MST and also the Lisa Campesina, also of Brazil, who managed to organize peasantry, those who get evicted in farms, who are organizing or trying to make their own livelihoods, where they have occupied and take the space, for example. So those for me are health equities, or that we can draw lessons from, at the same time build a movement that will represent the working class. But again, there is a question that how do you build that under capitalism? So that's the question that we should grappling with and build something on top of it, comrades. Also in our context as well, here in South Africa, we have movements that are organizing around land. For example, one comrade has made an example of Abahlali baseMjondolo, which I think, in my view, they've also made attempts as well in terms of how people can live in these occupations, how they can relate from the struggle that they are doing. They have introduced something like called Abahlalism, in terms of how people can stay among themselves, respecting the environment, having their own ways of living in their occupation. So for me, those are kind of possibilities that we can explore when it comes to the health equity. And also, even on our side, we have been exploring many experiments in terms of how people can sustain themselves in their occupations. For example, we kind of notice that people have claimed their own power on their own making. For example, establishing their own, I would say, attempts to basic services, having their own ways of doing things in their occupations, to challenge the state, at the same time to challenge the city of Cape Town, But now we don't know, for example, because all the time, comrades, I don't know. I want us to shift now, or it's good to speak about our problems as the working class and raise these problems. But we need to find a way in terms of how do we see ourselves building this movement, not just talking, or complaining, and build something that is tangible. For example, I know that most of us are more, I know I'm avoiding this point, but I have to say it. We are reaching a very critical moment, for example, to the working class areas where we will see many political parties contesting, trying to win over the working class trust and so on. But us as activists, we don't provide anything to the working class or from whatever that we are doing. So I think for me, we need to rethink our strategies in terms of, not because we can do these things, but we talk about system change. How do we change the system? And how do we take the struggle forward and make it a point that not only in South Africa, but internationally, so that we build a link, from what we are doing. For example, now there is a Palestinian struggle that is taking place. How do we feature, as activists? So for me, the working class comrades have been resisting, the brutality of the state, the neoliberalism. And I'm definitely sure as we speak, there is no short of protest. Every day there is a protest, So now it's a matter of where do we direct, our energies, and how do we organize, because I know I've been doing this for many years now, but now there is a sense of consciousness, draw lessons, and also get something out of what we are doing, so that we are not becoming people who are reacting from what is taking place, but as people who are thinking through as to what kind of a system do we want. But on my own side, I'm very clear it's socialism. I don't know about others, but my view is that how do we bring that project across to the working class? It becomes very critical, and it becomes very imperative, because now we are in a state where, for example, if there are registration, because I've noticed that I think it was 2 weeks back or last week, where there were registrations, and then I had a contact with the person that is working for IEC in one of the voting stations. I've phoned him to assess how many people who went through and registered. He told me clear, no, it's only 40, 40 people. So it tells us very clear that people are conscious, and as they are conscious, there is no movement from below that invites them to ideas that will be looking at the project of socialism. I'm not sure, I'm still...
Thank you, Bell. Thank you, Comrade.
Okay.
Masipamba, Amanda, and Comrade Bells are saying, so bangena socialism. I won't sing, because if I start that song, we'll be here until tomorrow. Thank you, Comrade. Thank you, Makabane, for those powerful inputs. And just to say to Cohort 5 that also the intention of such sessions is to understand activism as it goes beyond being just a fellow, but how do you immerse yourself in this conversation around change, and how do we organize ourselves? What are you doing in your space? What are you offering to the struggle that you claim to be fighting for? And I mean, a constant theme throughout from Thang to Bells, Bayanda, and Butami is action. Is that we do not only have to know what we know, but what are we doing about it? It's a call for action. What do we do about this?